Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's panel examining the recent unprecedented events in Kazakhstan. My name is Annette Bohr and I'm an associate fellow of the Russian Eurasia program at Chatham House in London, and I'll be chairing the panel today. It is a great pleasure to see so many people join and to be joined by such an expert panel. Now, in the space of only 2 weeks, Kazakhstan has undergone colossal change. Protests in early January over a single economic issue quickly escalated into nationwide demonstrations calling for improved socioeconomic conditions and a more accountable political system before morphing into scenes of violent unrest. President Tokayev declared a state of emergency, issued a shoot to kill without warning order, and took control of the National Security Council. In a dramatic move, he requested the assistance of the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization to prop up his regime, whose troops have already come and gone. The government has been replaced, and the rule of former President Nursultan Nazarbayev has come to an end. Not least, there was evidence of a battle for control between Tokayev's supporters and loyalists of Nazarbayev, as the current president ousted the head of the National Security Committee, who is one of Nazarbayev's staunchest allies, and accused him of treason and attempting a coup d'etat. After a long absence, only yesterday, former President Nazarbayev returned to public view to state in a video address that he is in Kazakhstan and fully supports President Tokayev. So speculation and theories abound, of course, and while it will take time to unearth hard facts and the answers to many open questions, we hope today to unravel in more detail several aspects of recent events and to discuss in greater depth whether or not we can expect substantive change. Can President Tokayev make good on his promises of reform? And who are the ultimate winners and losers in this new landscape? I'll now introduce our speakers and quickly address a few administrative points. We'll start with Kate Mallinson in London, who is an associate fellow of the Russian Eurasia program at Chatham House and managing director of PRISM Political Risk Management. We'll follow Kate with Dasim Satpayev, joining us from Almaty, who is the director of the Kazakhstan Risk Assessment Group, an Almaty-based think tank that researches political reform and transparency in Kazakhstan, and a very in-demand commentator on affairs in Kazakhstan, I might add. Joining us from Prague, our final speaker will be Bruce Pannier, who is truly a veteran journalist and correspondent covering Central Asia, who currently writes Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's blog, Kishlok Avazi, and is a well-known voice for observers of Central Asia through his appearances on RFRL's Majlis podcast. Welcome, Bruce, Dasim, and Kate, and thank you for agreeing to join us today to share your observations. After the introductory comments, I'll open up the question for Q&A. Please type in your questions using the chat function, or you can raise your electronic hand in the participants tab at the bottom of your screens if you wish to ask a question live. Dasim will present in Russian with simultaneous translation. If you need translation, please select the English channel in the translation tab on Zoom. Для тех, кто хочет слушать всю дискуссию по-русски, выберите русский язык в разделе «Перевод». If you have technical difficulties, please send a private message to Anna Morgan via the chat function. Last but not least, today's event will be held on the record and is being recorded for Chatham House's YouTube channel. So with that, Kate, I'll hand the floor over to you first.
Thank you, Annette, and good morning and good afternoon to everybody. So where to start? There's so much to discuss on Kazakhstan. And to begin with, I'm going to go back to 10 years ago when I remember having a fascinating meeting whereby I was told about the former head of security in Kazakhstan, Karim Masimov, and former President Nazarbayev's plans for the presidential transition. They were looking at a minister-mentor scenario similar to when Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew became minister mentor in 2004, with Nazarbayev becoming his successor's mentor. The Prime Minister of Singapore for 30 years until 1990 and widely recognized as the nation's founding father, Lee oversaw Singapore's transformation into a developed country with a high-income economy within a single generation. He forged a system of meritocratic, highly effective and anti-corrupt, albeit authoritarian government and civil service. When Lee died in 2015, Singapore held a week of national mourning with almost 2 million Singaporean residents, as well as world leaders paying tribute to him as his lying in state. The situation for former President Nursultan Nazarbayev, El-Basi, leader of the nation, or pensioner Nazarbayev, as he described himself yesterday, looks radically different from Lee's respected minister mentor status. And I think it's very far from what Nazarbayev himself expected. With protests rocking Kazakhstan for just under a week, a state of emergency imposed for nearly 2 weeks, 225 people dead, and 12,000 people arrested off the street, the former president's legacy, something that he was extremely proud of, now lies in tatters. I have many of his various hagiographies in my library, all of which are now missing a very complex postscript. So where did it all go wrong? I'm not going to go into the details of all Nazarbayev's achievements or where it went wrong. Suffice to say that in the early years, the former president was very much credited for Kazakhstan having the most impressive financial sector in the CIS and double-digit GDP growth. Nazarbayev had given up Kazakhstan's nuclear arsenal, entrenched the country's sovereignty by inviting in major investors, and started the fantastic Bolshak program, whereby many Kazakhs were sent abroad for education before returning to Kazakhstan. And then we saw last week's events, the symbolic culmination of the erosion of the social contract between Nazarbayev and the Kazakh population, which he had always vaunted, promising the Kazakhs stability and prosperity in return for limited political freedoms. At the beginning of January, the protesters voiced their complaints, not at the current government, but ad hominem directly towards Nazarbayev, raging against 3 decades of rule which did not serve their interests, but rather those of the ruling elite and their allies. They were railing against the personalized patron-client system of power that Nazarbayev himself constructed, dividing the economy and parceling it out to his lieutenants and family. A drop in commodity prices, COVID-19 and high inflation all added to the population's challenging socioeconomic conditions. But it wasn't the first warning sign of entrenched and angry disaffection. There have been many protests along the way, including most prominently the demonstrations in Zhanaozen in 2011, which led to the shooting of 14 oil workers. But January's protests were very different in that 14 cities across Kazakhstan, a country the size of Western Europe, fell to the protesters like dominoes. And then there were the protests that took place in Almaty, which differed substantially from those in the rest of the country. There are many narratives around today as to what actually happened in Almaty. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has spoken of 20,000 bandits attacking the commercial capital, and he has blamed foreign terrorists. Yet there's no evidence of this has been forthcoming yet. In an out of touch and heavily edited video yesterday, it was a recording, Nazarbayev surfaced after over 2 weeks of speculation about his whereabouts, and he mentioned organized riots and an attack on Kazakhstan to destroy the integrity of the country and the foundations of the state. He wholly endorsed Tokayev as head of the country and denied the existence of any intra-elite confrontation or conflict. Meanwhile, Kazakh diplomats and officials have pinned the unrest on foreign terrorists from Central Asia, Afghanistan, the Middle East, as well as Kazakh nationals who allegedly had links with the Islamic State. However, the most plausible explanation is that various elements of the wider Nazarbayev family, or Nazarbayev Inc., hijacked the genuine outbreak of popular anger and deployed armed groups from the dark underbelly that is Kazakhstan's criminal underworld and Salafist movements. It's possible that some of these mercenaries were from neighboring countries, but without some concrete evidence, it's hard to take seriously that this was a plot to establish the Islamic State in various provinces in Kazakhstan, as pushed by some officials. Meanwhile, both Russia and China have blamed the unrest on coloured revolutions, hinting that the West was behind the elephants. However, there is an enormous elephant in the corner. If there was an attack by an extremist Islamic movement, as the government purports, we need to understand why the twice Prime Minister, the head of the security services, the KMB, and Nazarbayev's right-hand man, Karim Asimov, has been arrested on suspicion of high treason, which is punishable with up to 15 years in prison. And also the fact that an unforgivable security void took place in Almaty from the 5th to the 7th of January, whereby the security services deliberately didn't carry out their obligations in protecting Kazakh citizens. For 2.5 days, while 225 people died. Was Massimov allowing ISIS elements to try and take over Kazakhstan? It seems very hard to believe. Tokayev's actions and his bombastic and bellicose words suggest that he did not expect the unrest, whereas the deliberate security void and subsequent mysterious suicides in the KMB suggest that those at the top of the security agencies did. Kazakhstan is a security state. It's extremely well informed and well prepared and more equipped to deal with an Islamist threat, since at least 600 Kazakh nationals are known to have traveled to Iraq and Syria to join IS. It is also unthinkable that they would not have known about such an attack and that they would not have been able to suppress it. As I wrote in an expert comment for Chatham House earlier this week, in spite of the government promising one, an independent investigation is barely conceivable in Kazakhstan, owing to the confluence of the Soviet legacy and secretive neo-patrimonial political systems that have left the government averse to telling the truth. A likely grand bargain has taken place between Nazarbayev and Tokayev, whereby Nazarbayev is not discredited. This was likely agreed before yesterday's video recording, and it means that the incumbent President Tokayev is unlikely to reveal that the Nazarbayev family essentially threw him under the bus. So Tokayev is not likely to reveal the whole truth, but he will need to account for the terrorism allegations, particularly as there are reports of extensive human rights abuses taking place in the prisons where ordinary protesters have been taken. As we might never know what happened with Massimov, we have to just kind of triangulate and make our own, piece together our own independent understanding from the various bits of misinformation, disinformation, and communication blackouts, which make it much harder. But the former president's speech yesterday gave us some further clues. His robust endorsement of Tokayev suggests that preliminary negotiations over the exit of the Nazarbayev family have been completed, and Nazarbayev has most likely secured the safe exit of key family members and the ability for these family members to quietly divest from their holdings or restructure their assets over a certain period of time. Most of the family members have been preparing for this day for over a decade, or for this moment, although it's still likely to have shocked them that X hour, as the moment of Nazarbayev's ultimate departure, has always been referred to in Kazakhstan. It's quite possible that this grand bargain is going to be one of the easiest hurdles that Tokayev has to overcome. We have to remember that this is not a cohesive family. Elements of the Nazarbayev family or the elites may still contest the settlement or find accommodation with Tokayev. This week, I've been looking at various scenarios for Kazakhstan, and there are a few common threads through all of them. Tokayev faces myriad challenges, both within and outside the country. Security is at the top of the agenda, both from the grassroots and potentially from those he's pushing out under the grand bargain. These threats have not gone and are likely to manifest themselves in several guises, as we saw in early January. Only this morning was the state of emergency lifted, but a red terrorist level threat remains in place in Almaty for the foreseeable future. Omicron is raging through the country, and Kazakhstan has the highest COVID-19 incident rate it has ever had. Tokayev faces elections in 2 years, and it's clear that his failure to distinguish between militant elements and genuine protesters has been, as some would say, disastrous. Scores of innocent people in Almaty have tragically been mixed up in the security operation, with many killed or facing serious abuses in detention. However, those not directly caught up or possibly looking upon Tokayev's actions quite favorably. I'm just going to end with 3 points that I think forms a part of the baseline scenario for the next phase of the transition, with Tokayev trying to remain in place. Firstly, I don't think there's going to be any let up in terms of repression. Similarly to his predecessor, Tokayev is focusing on the economy first and then politics. The protest genie is very much out of the bottle, and Tokayev will try very hard to keep a lid on it. Secondly, Russian leverage. Putin has got Kazakhstan, its closest ally, exactly where it wants it, with a weak president who owes him. We can expect Putin to call in many favors after bolstering Tokayev's rule. Finally, Tokayev was handpicked by Nazarbayev a few years ago, owing to his neutrality and lack of support from the elite. I think his justice towards the Nazarbayev family is likely to be selective. Similarly to neighboring Uzbekistan under President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, I don't personally envisage a wholesale farewell to the Nazarbayev family. I think some elite figures will be allowed to stay in return for financial and political support. With pleasure, I'm now going to hand over to Dosim, who will enlighten you with his knowledge from the ground. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Kate, for your scene-setting presentation. Dosim, I'll now hand over to you.
Okay, hi everybody. Well, thank you very much for invitation. If you don't mind, I'd like to continue my report in Russian. Well, it will be more fast and maybe more comfortable for me. And I'd like to start from very interesting news.
Quite recently in Italy, in Rome, there was meeting against COVID restrictions, and one of the protesters was holding a slogan saying that we will arrange something akin to what they saw in Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan is now in vogue, even though in Kazakhstan itself, there are a lot of questions about what actually happened and where to go from here. So I would start with dividing the entire situation into two processes that overlapped at the beginning of 2022. The first process is about social unrest. That's what we observed in very early January in Western Kazakhstan. It was a social explosion, and now the official propaganda is trying to present it as a well-premeditated tumult. But the rally of January the 2nd was totally unexpected for the powers that be in Kazakhstan. The very fact that Tokayev lost some time and then took a decision to drop gas prices and to make some concessions, including the dismissal of the government. He never raised a topic of the premeditated unrest. He agreed that it was social unrest and he was prepared to make certain concessions, but they lost control, and this wave of protests through Kazakhstan. And you are quite right, Kay, that we faced some protests like this in 2006, in 2011, in 2016, in 2019, and all of those rallies of those protests were stemming from the ineffective economic and social system that led to very dire economic situation. According to the World Bank, the poverty is ramping in Kazakhstan. Out of 6 million of children in Kazakhstan, 1 million children live in poor, impoverished families. There are a lot of children in institutions and childcare institutions because their families cannot sustain them. And the young people cannot find employment, and we should also remember about inefficient economy, economic situation, and corruption. And at the first stage in Almaty, the protests were also peaceful, and those protesters just expressed their support of Zhanaozen peers. There was no violence whatsoever. At a later stage, young people started gathering from the suburbs of Almaty, from other regions of Kazakhstan. Some of those were temporarily employed in Almaty, some were jobless. And that was a critical mass prepared for social aggression. I usually refer to 2012, when in Almaty during a pop concert, a riot exploded quite unexpectedly with the participation of young people who actually attended that pop concert, and they set cars on fire, and they looted shops, etc. And we started studying that social aggression, and we saw that there is a group of young people in Kazakhstan that see no prospects for their further development, who are not trained, who haven't got education or jobs, and these are factors of destabilization. So this first wave of young people who came to Almaty and started those protests were not terrorists. They are social outsiders, and powers that be for a long time refused that they even existed. And at the second stage, we saw some organized groups who actually strengthened this destabilization wave. They attacked the airport and they looted shops, etc. The commanders of the Committee of National Security did indeed get an instruction to leave their premises, to leave their buildings, and not to interfere. So that's when some of the elitist groups from the inner circles of Nazarbayev's cronies just started to incite protests. And some experts, including Russian ones, who know very little about the situation in Kazakhstan, said that there was a conflict between Tokayev and Nazarbayev, but indeed it wasn't so. Last year, Nazarbayev actually declared that he would be transferring the position to Nuratan Tokayev. Which means that he was prepared to support Tokayev as the next presidential candidate in 2024. And I think that it was then that part of Nazarbayev's cronies started to understand that Tokayev is not just a stooge, that he would be a political player. An additional factor that also was at play, and perhaps it exacerbated a conflict, not between Nazarbayev and Tokayev, but perhaps between Tokayev and Massimo, were the events of late December last year, because Nazarbayev, even then, wasn't observed anywhere in the information field. The last time we saw him was on the 28th of December at a summit in Petersburg, and everyone observed that he looked very sick. After that, he disappeared from radars, and the theory was vented that he had some problems with his health, and the problems were so severe that perhaps he would have to transfer all of his powers to somebody else, and he was on very close to death. So I would like to underscore that the invitation of CSTO forces to Kazakhstan had nothing to do with counter-terrorist operations. Tokayev was very much aware that he couldn't control and give instructions to the uniformed agencies and ministries. And Putin, as a key player in CSTO, stepped in. On the other hand, Tokayev needed Putin's support for the political and business elite of Kazakhstan to take his side. So in this conflict, Putin played a key role, and he played this key role even in the conflict between different elites in Kazakhstan. One of the pretexts for inviting CSTO forces to Kazakhstan was Tokayev's declaration that 20,000 of bandits, extremists, actually attacked Kazakhstan, including foreign terrorists. But then he dropped this argument altogether. So the question is, where are those 20,000 thugs or were those representatives of Taliban? But Taliban has 60 to 80,000 people or men, armed men, all in all. So can you believe that 1/3 of the Taliban was there in Kazakhstan? There was no proof about it. So the participation of these 20,000 thugs or saboteurs that were trained, that had arms, went nowhere. The reason he actually came up with this argument was to legitimize his invitation of the CSTO forces to Kazakhstan. When the CSTO forces appeared in Kazakhstan, what they did was to take certain infrastructure facilities under their control. They did not directly engage in anti-terrorist operation, quote unquote. But when Tokayev asked Putin for help, from that moment, certain problems emerge with the multi-vector policies in Kazakhstan. And now Tokayev owes Putin. Putin does not like weaklings, does not like weak leaders. And he's always been close to Nazarbayev because he thought that they were at par in their relations. And now he seems to believe that he offered a favor to Tokayev, and that makes Tokayev a weaker party in his eyes. So to Putin, Tokayev might be akin to Lukashenko, who is also dependent on his support and assistance. As far as the video recording that was aired yesterday, that of Nazarbayev, also supports the idea that Nazarbayev did not participate in this conflict with Tokayev, and you could see that he is not in good health still. And you could see that the video was actually recorded several times, and that there were some episodes put together. But the video is very important to Tokayev because it was critical for Tokayev to have this public support on part of Nazarbayev. Thus, Tokayev shows that it's not the takeover of powers, that Nazarbayev transferred those powers to him voluntarily. And that's exactly what Nazarbayev declared yesterday. And of course, it was addressed to Putin as well as a guarantor of Nazarbayev's personal safety and security. So Nazarbayev stated that the transit of power was ongoing in a peaceful manner. It is important for Putin because actually he is observing and monitoring the situation very closely to make sure that no revolt of the cronies of the elites would be possible in Russia. Nobody wants this situation to be viewed as the revolt of the successor against his predecessor. And now we can observe the following situation. Tokayev, thanks to this inter-elite conflict supported by the CSTO forces and Putin himself, has concentrated power in his own hands. And now the lower chamber of parliament said that they would repeal the constitutional provision on the Nazarbayev's reign in the National Security and Defense Council for life. And now we see that certain pressures have been started to put to bear on Nazarbayev's family members. So it is very similar to what we observed in Russia when President Yeltsin actually handed over his powers to Putin. Putin started pressurizing oligarchs who were close to Yeltsin, and in his first speech to MPs in Kazakhstan, he started with this topic of de-oligarchization of the economy. And his first message was that oligarchs should show loyalty to the new government and his presidency. And his second message was that oligarchs would be very closely monitored. And his third message was to the family members of Nazarbayev, saying that you will have to share your wealth. So he addressed Bulat Nazarbayev, Aliya Nazarbayeva, and when Tokayev spoke about the Kazakhstan-China border, and we know that Nurali Aliyev participates in this LRD project in Astana. After that, there were some dismissals of 3 sons-in-law, Nazarbayev's sons-in-law, from their positions. And now the major issue that emerges after Nazarbayev's and Tokayev's speeches is what is the bottom line of that bargaining. Will there be arrest among Nazarbayev's family? Will they get any guarantees of their safety and security? And speaking about Nazarbayev, I can guess that he has got those guarantees of his personal safety and security. So now we have to address the issues of the cult of the personality, Nazarbayev's personality. So Tokayev should show that he would reverse this policy of Nazarbayev's cult of personality. This said, we should remember that Tokayev is himself at the point of bifurcation, and there are several trajectories that he can opt for. The one is towards systemic changes and transformations in Kazakhstan, political and economic reforms that Nazarbayev never dared to undertake, because unless he does that, there would be another revolt and another unrest, or else he will toughen his grip on power and he would pursue oppressive policies. But that is a trajectory to dead end. So now we will be observing what happens and whether he will turn into Nazarbayev himself, or else he will try to start doing something useful to the country. Until 2022, Tokayev kept saying that he didn't have sufficient powers, that Nazarbayev was an obstacle and he couldn't do things the way he wanted. But now it's up to him to start doing very specific things, so that reforms are not about facelift, but about systemic transformations. We understand that Tokayev is not Saakashvili. Some of Saakashvili's tactics would be utilized, I think, including in counter or anti-corruption activities. And if he succeeds, then his situation would be much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tasim, for a fascinating presentation. Before moving on to Bruce, I'd just like you to unpack one of your statements, if you wouldn't mind, with regard to the calling in of CSTO troops. You said that in doing so, Russia has surely strengthened its influence in Kazakhstan. But how might we expect this influence to play out, this leverage? Do we see Kazakhstan being a more amenable member of the Eurasian Economic Union, for example, where previously it's put up some fights? Perhaps do you envision even a military base in the country? What do you say? You mentioned in one of your statements that Russia's influence has increased owing to the calling in of CSTO troops. And I wondered how you might expect this increased leverage to play out. Do you see Kazakhstan being a more amenable member of the Eurasian Economic Union, for example, where it has previously put up some fights, or can you envision possibly a Russian military base in the country?
Well, thank you very much, Anna, for very interesting question. Я хочу сказать, что
I'd like to say that Putin was most afraid that in the case of transfer of power from Nazarbayev to Tokayev, serious changes and transformations would start in Kazakhstan, and Kazakhstan would start drifting away from Russia, and they would have a very anti-Russian sentiment. And you know that those protest sentiments when the Eurasian Economic Union was established, a lot of Kazakh people objected to Kazakhstan's participation then. And economic statistics shows that Kazakhstan lost a lot because of its membership in that union. But once Putin supported Tokayev, he got certain guarantees that Kazakhstan would not be leaving Eurasian Economic Union, and that it will also stay part of this collective security treaty organization. Because at some point, Kyrgyzstan, for example, suspended his membership of that organization. And now Putin is sure that Kazakhstan would not follow suit. I doubt military bases would be deployed in Kazakhstan, because one should remember that even though Tokayev has got support from Putin, the Kazakh society is still not homogeneous. And in our report about the Kazakh events, we are describing these anti-Putin sentiment in Kazakhstan. And they have exacerbated of late because of the deployment of the CSTO forces. So we still have this sentiment against participation in both organizations. And now Russia has a competitor in this region, that's Turkey. Look at how nervous the Russian government is about Turkey's potential role. So to Moscow, this competition is not beneficial at all. And Tokayev inherited from Nazarbayev a society that is split, that is fragmented, that is convoluted, and that might be a problem for Tokayev.
Move on to Bruce now. You did mention our joint report from 2 years ago, to which you and Kate and I all contributed. Anna might put up a link to it now, and we certainly can say that Kazakhstan was indeed and is being tested by transition, as is the name of the report. So I'd like to move on to Bruce now. Bruce, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annette. And first, of course, I'd like to thank Chatham House for the invitation to participate in this event. It's always an honor to speak at Chatham House. And thanks to Kate and Dosim, because they covered some of the ground I was going to cover in my speech, so I'm able to shorten this and just make some passing reference to a few things now too. I'd also like to express my sympathies and condolences to Kazakhstan and its people for all they've been through since the start of this year. I'm speaking about the Kazakhstan's National Security Committee, or the KNB, and what's changed in recent days and what changes are coming in the near future, it seems. We've heard about the Nazarbayev video, and that he said that this has nothing to do with inter-elite fighting in the country. Obviously, there's evidence that suggests that that's not true entirely. But a lot of this is guesswork. We really don't know. There's not a lot of names of people being put out there. Who was against Tokayev, who was for Tokayev. So that's why I picked the security service, because this is like one of the only windows we have into seeing what's happened, get an idea of what's happened, because there actually are people who have been dismissed and are now suspected of having played some part in the unrest. Karim Masimov, of course, was fired as the KNB chief on January 5th. He was detained on January 8th, and he is now facing charges of terrorism, specifically attempted violent overthrow of the government and exceeding his authority. But he wasn't the only one in the KNB that's been dismissed. And I want to look at some of these other people who have also lost their positions during this. First, I want to mention that in the KNB, there are 2 first deputy chairmen and 7 deputy chairmen, right? So we know about Samat Abish. He was a first deputy chairman. He has been dismissed. At first, there was a lot of confusion about what it was. He was reported as dismissed. The KNB said no. They said he was on extended vacation, and then we finally find out that he was dismissed. I'm also aware of the fact that there's talk that Masimov is being made a scapegoat for all this, and I don't know. Maybe that's true, but I would suggest that the dismissal of Abish seems to indicate that they're at the least going to great lengths to frame Masimov, and it tends to, in my opinion, to make less probable the possibility that Masimov is simply being made a scapegoat. Now, the other 3 deputy chairmen who were sacked on January 9th, and to keep running count of that, that means that out of the 9 deputy chairmen and 1 and chairman of the KNB, half of them have been dismissed since Masimov went down. So the 3 that lost their jobs on January 9th are Murat Asipov, Daulat Yergozhin, Anor Sadikulov. Yergozhin and Sadikulov have since been detained, but I've not seen that Asipov was detained, though it might be important to note that Asipov was the KNB chief in Almaty city from 2013 to 2016. And of course, Almaty is where most of the violence and destruction just took place. Sadikulov was the commander of the KNB's elite commando unit. Out of Stan, it was called, they refer to it, and seem to refer to it now as A. And he was also a member of Kazakhstan's Security Council. Nazarbayev was, of course, the secretary of the Security Council until January 5th, when he was sacked by Tokayev, although Nazarbayev's spokesman later claimed that Nazarbayev stepped down voluntarily. Now, Sadikulov spent his whole career in the security services in Kazakhstan. But Daulat Yergozhin is very curious to me because he had no experience in security before being named deputy chairman in the KNB. Yergozhin, who's only 42, started out working in the oil sector, and then in 2006 started working in the finance ministry. He was eventually the head of the finance ministry's tax committee, the ministry's state revenue committee, before being named deputy chairman at the KNB in November 2016, just 2 months after Masimov was appointed head of the KNB. Interestingly, to me at least, Asipov and Sadikulov both also worked in the Presidential Security Service. Sadikulov actually headed the Presidential Security Service in 2013 and 2014, and again from July 2019 to January 2020. So there seems to be a lot of crossover between the KNB and the Presidential Security Service. They should be communicating, of course, on matters concerning the safety of the head of state, but on a personal level, many of them would have friends or acquaintances in both the KNB and the Presidential Security Service. Now, when Tokayev removed Masimov as KNB chief, he immediately made the head of the Presidential Security Service, Yermak Sagenbayev, the new KNB chief. Sagenbayev started his career in the KNB, working there from 1994 until 2006 when he moved over to the Presidential Security Service. Sagenbayev was appointed deputy head of the Presidential Security Service on May 8, 2019, exactly 7 weeks after Tokayev became acting president of Kazakhstan. Sagenbayev became the head of the Presidential Security Service on August 25th, 2021. I'm speaking about these people because, again, of all the guesses that can be made about who was for or against Tokayev, there's reason to suggest that those top 5 KNB officials were all against Tokayev, while Sagenbayev appears to have played some valuable role for Tokayev. Now, I want to also mention the 2 new KNB deputy chairmen that they've appointed, presumably who are also loyal to Tokayev. That's Bakitbek Kostjanov and Askar Amirkhanov, both longtime KNB employees. Kostjanov joined the KNB in 1994. One interesting piece of information about him is that he was a member of a 24-member commission formed in 2012 and tasked with overseeing the use of financial resources for industrial and innovative projects. So he possibly should have some knowledge of how money was being spent and where it was being shifted around and possibly money that wasn't being spent for its intended purposes. The commission was headed by the former Minister of Economic Development and Trade and also former National Bank Chief Kairat Kilimbeto. Amirkhanov joined the KNB in 1996, and since 2004, he has been a deputy chief of the KNB's Anti-Terrorism Center. Probably a coincidence, but maybe worth mentioning that Tokayev promoted both Amirkhanov and Segimbayev to the rank of Major General at an award ceremony on May 6th, 2020. Of course, at that same ceremony, Tokayev also bestowed the rank of Lieutenant General on Karim Masimov. And before I want to move forward, I want to thank you, Kate, for mentioning the terrorists, because I did want to mention something about this, that certainly if there were 20,000 terrorists, this represents a complete failure in the security services. But I wanted to kind of put that in perspective too, that 20,000 people is roughly the size of neighboring Kyrgyzstan's armed forces. So the fact that you could assemble that many people, around in the areas surrounding Almaty seems absolutely impossible, especially when you consider that on December 16th, when the country marked Independence Day, it was also marking the 35th anniversary of Zholtoksan and the 10th anniversary of the Zhana Ozen tragedy. And you would have thought that the security forces would have been looking all over the country to make sure that nothing happened at those on December 16th. And yet 2 weeks later, they missed 20,000 people in the hills above Almaty. And also mentioned too that the foreign trained part of the foreign trained terrorists, I know that that's what one of the reasons has been given for sacking Masimov and the others was they failed to do that. But the foreign trained part of it strikes me because I don't see any training required in what happened. There doesn't seem to have been any plan except to create chaos and see what happened. And that doesn't require a lot of forethought or planning in advance. So that's another part of that story that just kind of falls apart for me. And it also it leads me to believe that blaming Masimov on them for not finding foreign trained terrorists was not the reason that he was sacked at all. Okay, now there's also one more thing, and something I noticed that something just changed right before we started, but the government resigned on January 4th and Tokayev accepted the resignation on January 5th, and a new government was named on January 11th. It's worth noting that Interior Minister Erlan Turgumbayev was not sacked and was reappointed to be Interior Minister. Now, Defense Minister Murat Bektanov also kept his post, but I heard just before we started that he was sacked because Tokayev said that the military didn't do enough to keep order. So he seemed to be out of suspicion. I don't know exactly where he is now, but it is significant that the head of the KNB was fired immediately, whereas the Defense Minister and Interior Minister were left alone, at least until today in the case of the Defense Minister. Now, what's happening and what's going to happen in the future? On January 11th, when the new government was named, Tokayev also said there was going to be major restructuring. Actually, I think he said radical restructuring in the entire National Security Service, which shows he's still not convinced that everyone in the security service was on his side. He's ordered that the Interior Ministry and National Guard should be strengthened, quote, quantitatively and qualitatively, unquote. His mention of the National Guard is interesting because we just had an example of what could happen to the National Guard, and did happen in neighboring Uzbekistan. Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev greatly strengthened Uzbekistan's virtually toothless National Guard and made it the leading security body in the country, while he, at the same time, stripped powers from the once feared State Security Service and Interior Ministry of Uzbekistan. And so when Tokayev starts talking about forming a National Guard, it's early and we don't have many details on this, but it makes me wonder if he's looking to do a similar, something similar to what Mirziyoyev did, but which is essentially creating an all-powerful security body that's loyal and answerable solely to the president of the country. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. What a fantastic presentation. And I'd like to point out to our audience members that Bruce has just published today on Radio Liberty's website a really informative article about the KNB. So anyone who wants to read more on that, you can get it there. And Bruce, it brings to mind your mentioning of the 20,000 terrorists and the various fabrications that have come about in the course of the government's defense and presentation of the situation. How on earth are they going to embark on a genuine investigation of matters while having all these fabrications to deal with, such as the 20,000 terrorists?
You know, this is something I keep going back and forth over. They made so many rash statements in the early days of this, and I don't see how they're going to be able to walk those back. You know, and Dosim mentioned that you haven't really heard this claim of 20,000 foreign terrorists or foreign trained terrorists lately. I mean, that was something that happened in the first couple of days, and they don't bring it up anymore. They still say there's terrorists in the country and there's counterterrorism operations going on, but they don't go to with that extreme figure or branding it as foreign trained. And again, I agree that they had to say foreign, or they couldn't have called in the CSTO with that. But there's a lot of other claims that he made at the same time, notably about the role of civil society and media. You know, that they were unhelpful and potentially threatening to the country for a while, and that he was going to clamp down on that. You know, these are also very concerning comments coming from him. You know, I don't think a lot of this, I'm sure he wishes everyone would forget about. But I'm trying to figure out how he's going to, like I said, walk this back and try to claim that, you know, he didn't have full information, which is kind of a lame excuse. That further information that came to light suggested that maybe some of this was not true, that he'd heard before, that you know, he was only referring to specific media outlets or civil society organizations when he made this sweeping comment about their unhelpful role. You know, so there's a lot of things he's going to have to, that the public won't forget. You know, it'll be interesting to see how much he wants to dwell on this in public conversation, but he's going to have to, like I said, try to modify the understanding that I people like me anyway received when he made these kind of claims. Say like shoot to kill. You know, he was just on a roll there where everything was harsh comments that a lot of people think were uncharacteristic for him and weren't really. I mean, it was a script that was written for him, and he was told to be like this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I'm pleased now to open the conversation up to our audience more broadly, and I can certainly see that a number of interesting questions that have come in. And I'm going to begin with one by Alex Folks. And he asked, to what extent might we see a Saudi-style taxing of the Nazarbayev family? And among the favors that President Putin might call in, is he likely to bring Kazakhstan's energy exports into his political calculations? So I was wondering if perhaps Dosim would like to take this one, and then if either Kate or Bruce would like to add their thoughts as well. Dosim, have you had the question?
Yes. Well, excuse me, Anna, can you repeat, because we have some problems with connection? Yes.
Yes.
I have some problems with, yeah.
To what extent might we see a Saudi-style taxing of the Nazarbayev family? And among the favors that President Putin might call in, is he likely to bring Kazakhstan's energy exports into his political calculations?
Well, я хотел бы здесь сказать то, что...
Yeah, I would like to say that it is a very salient point, and we actually spoke about it in our Chatham House report, that after Nazarbayev, or once Nazarbayev loses his capacity, the ownership will be redivided in Kazakhstan. And this redivision or restructuring of ownership will take place very fast. Now we see the first stage of this process. Now Tokayev, striving to get a higher ratings or to become more popular, decided to target individual oligarchy groups or individual rich people related to Nazarbayev's family. And you will know that Nazarbayev's family used to control various sectors of the national economy. Oil and gas, for example, Aliyah controlled, and her business was mentioned in Tokayev's speech. She controlled the utilization of used cars, right? And she introduced even a special tax for the disposal of used cars, and that gave her billions in proceeds, and she had a private company. And tax was not collected by the government, but by that company. Now, Tamikin, he was a key player in oil and gas sector of Kazakhstan. And a lot of his people are positioned very high in the energy sector of Kazakhstan. And now you know that certain inspections have started in many of private companies in this sector. So I think that we would be observing a domino effect. When one key figure is taken away, Talibayev, Dariga, Aliya will be losing their position, and as a result, the intra-elite pyramids will start crumbling. So each of them has got their own pyramids, but they will start being destroyed since they will have no free access to resources, and their clients, their partners will be deserting them. So very soon in Kazakhstan, we might observe criminal prosecution of some of the top managers in those companies. Why? It's just a tactic. You start with small fish, and then they talk to you, and then they provide you information, incriminating information on their bosses and on big fish. So now perhaps it is this stage of collecting information, some compromising information against the top figures. It won't affect, I think, the energy policy of Kazakhstan, because the major basis is in Western oil and gas private companies, multinational companies. Of course, it might undermine or at least affect the stability, but I don't foresee any major problems.
Given the ubiquity of Nazarbayev associates in the state apparatus, meaning they're simply everywhere, spreading across all spheres, is it really possible to replace them? And surely the removal of a number of big business elites would make investors nervous, don't you think?
Но опять же, как показывает пример Узбекистана.
Uzbekistan experience shows with Shavkat Mirziyoyev. When Shavkat Mirziyoyev says that you can pick out large figures from various sectors without huge impact or huge harm or damage to that sector. But the question is, who will replace them? We can observe a situation whereby one oligarchs will be replaced by others. And Tokayev said that some of the national companies should be privatized. Nazarbayev also spoke about privatization in 1990s, but it gave no expected results since many of them were privatized by his cronies.
Division of spoils is actually going to work and whether or not it's realistic. I'd like to bring Bruce and Kate in on this discussion now, and we have a question that ties in with this rather well from Tom Main, and he asks, will key Nazarbayev family members, Dariga Nazarbayeva, Dinara, Timur, be allowed to stay in Kazakhstan? Will they truly be sidelined, given, for example, Kulibayev's billions, held outside the country, of course, and power based on near total control of the oil and gas industry? I know, Jasim, you have mentioned and responded to parts of this question, but perhaps Bruce and Kate, would you like to add anything here? Bruce?
I was going to let Kate go first.
Okay,
but,
Kate, let's go for it, Kate.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a couple of things. I mean, at the moment, last week, President Tokayev set up a fund, which he announced in Parliament, for people to put money into. And I think that's quite a good place to look to see what's happening and what bargains are taking place behind the scenes, because I don't think, I think there's a queue of people waiting to speak to Tokayev to see how they can be accommodated if they want to be accommodated. And at the moment, it's peanuts that's been put into this fund, but hopefully we will see more, and we will get some kind of indication of who are going to be the winners and who are going to be the losers out of this fallout. I think in terms of Tom Main's question, I would just say that if we're going to look at what's happened and the most plausible scenario, then again, it seems that there are certain members of the elite who will be more palatable for Tokayev. And that's more the Kulibayev camp than the Dariga camp, who could be seen as being associated with the alleged perpetrators of the palace coup. And we know that Dariga and Tokayev have had their fallouts quite publicly as well in the past. I kind of agree that, Kulibayev's got his finger in a lot of energy pies, and it'd be really hard to extract him from the sector. He's also got financial resources. He's also seen as more respectable than some of the other sons-in-law. He's seen as more talented and having brought more into the country, even though there are obviously other allegations. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So presumably, as I mentioned before, the proposed division of spoils is going to be very tricky. I mean, you have to give something up in order to avoid prison or exile. And I was wondering, Bruce, if you have any thoughts on that particular question. How is this proposed division of spoils, this stratification of wealth, going to work, and is it really realistic?
I like the term you use, division of spoils. I mean, obviously that's something that's going to happen. What I'm also thinking about is, you got to remember how these protests started, right? Okay, well, it started over the increase in the price of fuel, but it became a popular protest specifically against Nazarbayev, his family, and these business elites that have grown fat, while he was in there. Now, Tokayev has to maintain some degree of popular support, especially as he's consolidating his own power after what just happened. If nobody from the Nazarbayev family and none of the known business elites are punished at all for what's happened, and they're able to buy their way out of jail, essentially, by giving up some money, I don't think that's going to satisfy the public. And I think it will just hasten the next round of protests. I mean, someone has to take the fall, someone big has to take the fall for what just happened.
And Masimov is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bruce, returning here to the KNB, Najam Abbas has asked a great question. What do you say to Alexander Kot's claiming that the Kazakhstan unrest could have been incited through provocateurs by KNB agents?
I mean, I've been in places when unrest broke out and the law enforcement agencies had a hard time restoring order. I don't know how much, the KNB, it seems like their main fault was they disappeared, right? And that's not to say that they didn't have some elements that went out and instigated some of this violence. And in such an environment, especially like we saw in Almaty, it doesn't take very much to get these things going. I mean, it's charged, people are got lots of energy and stuff, and they see a car burning or somebody smashing the windows of a building or something, and you're bound to attract people who really weren't thinking about doing that 5 seconds earlier. So did some KNB people, were they sent specifically to do something like that? Start some cars on fire, do some property damage, see who you can lure in to do this. It's possible, certainly in Almaty, but Taraz, Taldi Korgan, some of these places. But if that was part of somebody's plan, then it's strange that they limited it to only a few areas, really in the east and the south. Most of the country was untouched by this, and by far most of the protests remained peaceful. So, maybe they had to throw it together hastily, but I still don't, it seems like if you were going to really let everything loose, then you might as well just let everything loose at that point and call everybody and tell them just go out and get things going, start some violence, and then we got a better chance of getting what we want out of this.
Yeah, this is one of the real mysteries of the situation, and I wanted to turn to Dasim here because, as Bruce points out, it's one thing to take President Tokayev's statement criticizing the KNB for having slept through the activities of the fighters, as he said, and it's another to say that they were directly complicit and in fact perpetrators of the current unrest. And I'd like to get your opinion there, Dasim, on that question.
Well, thank you, Annette. Well, I'd like to say that when Mr. Tokayev made statements with some critique towards the Committee of National Security. Well, I remember again Uzbekistan, when Mr. Shavkat Mirziyoyev received position of president of Uzbekistan. His first step, it was criticized towards the Service of National Security of Uzbekistan. Well, and I remember Shavkat Mirziyoyev, he declared that Secret Service of Uzbekistan is not very effectiveness and we should to make a lot of changes. And if you know that 2018, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, he changed name of Secret Services. Well, I believe when Mr. Tokayev criticized of Committee of National Security, well, it was, well, for him, it was very important to declare that Committee of National Security, this is Karim Masimov. This is too, well, it was very important to get together Karim Masimov with Secret Service of Kazakhstan. Because when he declared that Karim Masimov was arrested, well, it means that all Committee of National Security, it's very dangerous organization now, and that's why we should to make a lot and deep reform inside of secret services. Mm-hmm. Well, but it's very interesting that he make very good statements towards to the police. Well, in his speech, he made statements that in compare with Committee of National Security, police, it was more effectiveness during this unrest because policemen organized very good fighting against terrorists in Almaty. Well, it was some interesting contradictions between two law enforcement bodies. Well, but I believe that for Mr. Tokayev now very important to increase influence inside in Ministry of Defense, police, and inside of secret services. It's very important task for Tokayev now.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much, Jasim. I'm conscious that we've only focused on the domestic aspect, and so I'm going to turn a bit now to the international component of this unrest, and I'm going to group two questions together. One by Peter Frankopan, who says, what lessons get drawn from this across the region? Should we expect crackdowns to keep the genie in the bottle, elite unrest, and capital flight? And also a question by Craig Oliphant, who asks if we can say, if the speakers could say a bit more about how they see the impact of Kazakhstan events on Russia-China relations and its approach towards the region. And this is a very fair point because we've seen all sorts of reports about tensions, alleged tensions between the two of them that don't really appear to be on the mark. Bruce, Jasim, Kate, who would like to go first on these two questions?
I'm happy just to talk about capital flight. And I think we all know that that was already taking place, kind of started about 20 years ago from Kazakhstan, for example. Over $160 billion, I think, has been estimated to have left the country. People have been waiting for this period, knowing that their futures are not guaranteed in a post-Nazarbayev era. So I think this will be a lesson to many of the wealthy elites throughout the region. Just a reminder to call their lawyers. And in terms of, in terms of security, I think we can already see sort of tremors being felt across the region, and particularly in Turkmenistan, about similar protests. I mean, it's not, you know, we've got the same situation in England here with high inflation and rising costs. So it's not, that situation is not just unique to Central Asia, but I think, yes, a lot of the leaders will be having a few sleepless nights at the moment.
Bruce, how do you see it? Should we expect crackdowns to keep the genie in the bottle throughout the region? What are the lessons that we can draw from this across the region? And I know that Jasim would probably refer to Russia. What is your opinion, Bruce?
You know, in all the years I've watched Central Asia, every time there's unrest in any country at all, the other countries, the first thing they look at is what were the security failures that allowed this to happen. They don't look at the, you know, maybe if we gave the people more of what they want or loosened up the system or something that we would have actual popular support and these things wouldn't happen. They always look at it through the prism of there was a lapse somewhere in the police or the security forces or something like that. And what do we do to make sure that it doesn't happen in our country? Every single time, this is the kind of lessons that they learn. So I think that's almost certain in Central Asia, is that all of the governments are looking and making sure that what happened in Kazakhstan, could it possibly happen in their country? And like Kate just mentioned, I mean, Turkmenistan, of all places, where you think, it's such a monolith authoritarian system, this wouldn't even be possible, but even they were concerned with something like that. One other thing I would mention in this too is I think the role of managed transition of government in Central Asia is really taking a hit from this. With Atambayev passing over power to Jayinbekov, and now this difference between, with Nazarbayev and Tokayev, I think that the model of managed transition is probably out in Central Asia for a while, and then most likely would be replaced by what we saw with Karimov, where you stay in until you die, or what looks to be about to happen in Turkmenistan and probably Tajikistan, which is dynasty.
Yeah. Certainly, I don't really think that Putin will be taking the Nazarbayev example on board for himself. Dasim, would you care to comment on the question about China, and if you see any sort of impact of events in Kazakhstan on Russia-China relations and its approach to the region? Has it strengthened their partnership? Has it created extra tensions?
Well, I'd like to say, if we look to last events in Kazakhstan, and if we talk about the reaction of China towards to these events, we can see that China was very careful, because it's my point of view. I believe that in Beijing, it was a very big surprise that in Kazakhstan suddenly was such kind of unrest and some very strong inter-elite conflicts. I believe for China, it was very big surprise that collective organization of security recently appeared in Kazakhstan. Well, but for China, more important to save stability in Kazakhstan. It means that China will support any president in Kazakhstan who will guarantee such kind of stability, because you know that China invested a lot of money to Kazakhstan. You know that Kazakhstan is the main transit routes, if we talk about the project One Belt, One Road, from China towards to the Europe. Yes, but from another hand, China very well knows that in Kazakhstan very strong anti-China moods. Well, and it's like it's an anti-Russian moods. Well, and I believe that in China, very important if Mr. Tokayev will guarantee stability in Kazakhstan, and for more important for China, guarantee stability if we talk about the inter-state relations between two countries. Well, I'm not sure that China will try to interfere in internal policy of Kazakhstan. Well, in compare with Russia, I'm not sure. But I believe that if China will receive information that in Kazakhstan will increase investment risks and will be new, more strong destabilization, well, China will close border towards to Kazakhstan. Well, last time we can see the same situation when China establish artificial obstacles for Kazakh goods, Kazakh business, because China closed border. Well, and Kazakh business didn't receive access to China market. Well, it was very big problems last year, for example. Why? Because I believe China tried to make punishment of Kazakhstan, because China tried to show, well, in Kazakhstan we saw anti-China moods. It means that we should to make signals to Astana. You should to decrease anti-China moods, because we can to organize some economical pressure to you. Well, it was very interesting signals last year that China can to use some economical instruments of pressure towards to Kazakhstan. Well, but I believe Tokayev will try to continue good relations with China. Well, as like as with Russia.
Indeed, he has little choice but to do so. Well, amongst our audience members, there's particular interest being exhibited towards Masimov. 3 questions, in fact, and they really seem to have Bruce's name on them. So I'm going to address them to you now in the form of a question by John Patton, who says that following off from John Luff's question and from Cameron Evans' questions, Masimov and the KNB are masters of misinformation. Could this be a temporary imprisonment to give cover to the former elite, allowing them to take more wealth out of the country? There have been rumors of significant wealth transfers, physical and electronic, happening during the unrest, including many private planes arriving in Dubai, including a quick flight of Masimov reportedly prior to his arrest. So Bruce, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the key words here are prior to his arrest. I mean, it seemed to me that this was happening when everyone understood that the situation was starting to fall apart. I don't think that they needed to get Masimov, by the time Masimov was sacked, a lot of this had already taken place, or was certainly in the works. So I don't know if he's supposed to be a decoy. That would be, I mean, in the murky world of Kazakh politics, I wouldn't want to rule anything out in particular, but it seems unlikely to me anyway, like I said, because this would have been, if a lot of this had happened after he was sacked and detained, then I would have said yes. But I mean, he wasn't detained until the 8th, and by then, all these planes had come and gone on the 5th and 6th, and you'd heard all these stories about money being transferred around and everything, and not so much after. So I personally don't see that. I mean, I really think that there was a failure in the security services, or at least President Tokayev thought there was a failure in the security services somewhere, and he had information that Masimov was part of some group that was out to get him out of power. No, that's my opinion.
Yeah, but as John Luff so succinctly puts it, is Masimov really out? Do you think that there might be a real rehabilitation at some point in the future?
That's if it is in the future, I think it would have to be a long ways down the road. Like I made the point a while ago that with all these protests against the entrenched elite and the Nazarbayev family, somebody has to be held up publicly to account. And right now he's the only one. To turn around and say, oh well, he maybe he didn't mess up that bad. I mean, he's being accused of plotting the violent overthrow of the country. Now, how do you come up with a line that exonerates him from that and say, no, I made a mistake on that? I mean, that's a tough one. So I don't see him getting out of prison or being released anytime soon. I mean, he is the only one that the public knows very well that's being held to account for everything that just happened.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Kate and Dasim, would you like to weigh in on this question? Either of you?
I'd like to hear what Dasim says. But
okay, Dasim, as an insider. On the question of Masimov and whether or not he's really and truly out. Can you hear me, Dasim?
Sorry. Well, I'd like to remind that last year in Kazakhstan was very big scandals. This is very big. It's not Kazakhstan. It wasn't only in Kazakhstan big scandals. In international scandals connected with Pegasus. Pegasus. This is when some secret services in some countries use some technology to unofficially hear some politicians, journalists in different countries. Well, in Kazakhstan, it was very interesting information that, for example, Mr. Tokayev, yes, he was under the control of secret services. He was under the, Mr. Tokayev and some representatives of Kazakh elite, well, was in the blacklist. And this person, when they make some calls by phone, this person, they didn't know that all conversation of this person, it was information about this conversation received our secret services. Yes, and last year it was very big scandals about it. And a lot of people in Kazakhstan believe that Mr. Karim Masimov, the chairman of Committee of National Security, maybe he used this is technology to increase control to some people in political and business elite of Kazakhstan. Well, it means that maybe last year it was some black cat between Tokayev and Karim Masimov after the scandals. Well, but if we talk about the Karim Masimov, we should remember that Karim Masimov sometimes, when he was the chairman of Committee of National Security, for a long time, he received a lot of delicate information about the whole political and business elite of Kazakhstan. It means that he is a very dangerous person for Mr. Tokayev. It means that for Mr. Tokayev, it's very important to stay Mr. Karim Masimov imprisoned. Well, it's like I said, Gulnar Karimov in Uzbekistan. Well, the daughter of Islam Karimov, she's know very well about different people in Uzbek elite, and she received a lot of information about these people. The same situation with Karim Masimov. He received access to very interesting and very compromised information about Mr. Tokayev, maybe about his circle. That's why for Mr. Tokayev, very important to control Karim Masimov and to stay Karim Masimov, if Mr. Karim Masimov will stay in Kazakhstan. And it means that Mr. Karim Masimov will be imprisoned for a long time. Well, it's my point of view.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
A question directed specifically to you, Dasim, from Ayjan Shershenova, who basically says that, in her opinion, Kazakhstan has behaved very poorly in relation to Kyrgyzstan by detaining and even beating Kyrgyzstanis, and in essence by attempting to put the blame on them. And in your opinion, will President Tokayev try to make the situation somewhat better, or will he continue to basically criticize citizens from Kyrgyzstan and accuse them of terrorism?
Yes, well, when I talk about the information, official information about the foreign terrorists, yes, last time we have very big scandals between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan about it, because our police captured some Kyrgyz citizens, but he was just singer. Well, but he was accused. Well, he is terrorist. Well, but we know that in Kyrgyzstan it was very big scandals, and a lot of people demand, well, you should return this man in Kyrgyzstan because he's not terrorist. He's just singer. Yes, he's very peaceful man. Yes, it was very big scandals. Well, and that's why in Kazakhstan now a lot of doubt toward to the official information about foreign terrorists and extremists. Well, but I'd like to say that for a long time, when we talk about the Nazarbayev and Mr. Tokayev and now the representatives of political elite of Kazakhstan, for a long time, these peasants, they talk about Kyrgyzstan with very negative, it was very negative statements. Well, in Kyrgyzstan, you can see a lot of revolution. In Kyrgyzstan, you can see very bad situation in economical system. In Kyrgyzstan, we can see disorder and unrest. Well, but I believe that Kyrgyzstan, it's very interesting example. When during a lot of different model of change of power, well, in Kyrgyzstan, we can see some stable of situation. But in Kazakhstan, for a long time, our official propaganda say, well, Kazakhstan, one of the stable state in Central Asia region. But we can see that last events very good show that inside of Kazakh society, inside of Kazakh state, a lot of potential hotbeds and inter-elite conflicts in our country will be one of the cause of future very big explosions. Well, in compare with Kyrgyzstan, for example. Well.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 4 minutes left, so I'd like to close by asking all of you a question, and it is with regard to the prospects for substantive reform in Kazakhstan. We know that without a legitimate outlet for grievances on the part of the population, protests will likely continue. All of you have made that particular comment. But insofar as there are so many obstacles to substantive reform, do you see any genuine reform, either socioeconomic or political, being undertaken by Tokayev regime, or can we expect more of the same? And let's go in the order with which we began. So Kate, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Annette. Yeah, I'm muted. Well, genuine reform would be a total overhaul of the political economy that Nazarbayev has constructed over the last 30 years. So unfortunately, the protesters' grievances relate to very long-term structural, socio and economic challenges. So that's not going to happen overnight. What the government is planning to do, and there's been, some positive announcements by the president about how he's going to raise salaries and kind of extend debt relief and other more temporary issues. I think we'll only know really about whether he's serious about kind of addressing structural change once we see what happens with the elite and whether it's throwing them all out or with the bathwater or not.
Yes, thank you. And indeed, President Tokayev has said that any political reforms will be postponed until September, so we hear. Dasim, what is your view?
Well, if we talk about the social economical reform, I believe it's one of the important tasks for Mr. Tokayev to increase the level of middle class in Kazakhstan, because it's a very big problem. And it's very long-term economical program, because we know that it's impossible very fast to increase the quantity of middle class in Kazakhstan, because for a long time in Kazakhstan we can see maybe a lot of people who belong to poor population, and maybe some level between middle class and poor population. Well, it means that if Mr. Tokayev will decide to decrease social tension in Kazakhstan, well, I believe it's one of the main tasks for him to increase middle class in my country. But I believe we have one of the very big obstacles when we talk about the economical reform. I call it collective Nazarbayev. Well, collective Nazarbayev, it means our bureaucracy. Because let's imagine that, okay, Nazarbayev will die tomorrow. But in any case, if we look to our bureaucracy, if we look to our regional elite, if we look to our business elite, well, the most part of these people, it's people from the Nazarbayev political system and economical system. That's why I'm not sure that Mr. Tokayev will realize effectiveness economical reform with this ineffectiveness instrument. I mean our bureaucracy. But if we talk about the political reform, one of the main tasks for Mr. Tokayev to increase trust of local people towards to the state structures, because the level of trust in Kazakhstan very low. But it's impossible without political reform. It's impossible without new parliament, without new political parties. Well, because a lot of people in Kazakhstan, they believe, well, our parliament and our political elite, this is success of Nazarbayev. It means that we should to change these people, because in civic society, a lot of people who can to realize themselves as new state managers. Yes, we have a lot of people in Kazakhstan. If we talk about our small and medium business, I believe a lot of very good managers in our business, they can to receive very good position in state structures, and I believe it will be very good new human capital. If we talk about the reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Dasim. And Bruce, the final word goes to you. A very difficult question, but how do you gauge the prospects for reform in Kazakhstan in light of recent events?
Reform as such, not so much. I think the socioeconomic situation in the country will probably see great improvement in the coming months, because again, Tokayev needs to show that things are getting better. We assume that he's going to have a lot more money to help fund these efforts, because he's going to be taking money from elite that's on the outs right now and businessmen. But I don't know if it's going to be, sustainable, if that's going to be something like permanent reform or anything, a new package to change that. I think he's just going to try to essentially buy them off and keep them happy. And we always got to remember too that there's although there have been protests in Kazakhstan, for several years now, the government treats socioeconomic protests much differently than they treat political protests, right? So they let the socioeconomic ones go to a certain extent, post Andijan anyway, but what they don't want is the political protests. So he might be able to solve two problems at once. If he improves the socioeconomic conditions in the country and the standard of living, he buys himself some time, and he might be able to eventually loosen up or implement some political reforms. But I would just remind that although the protests were against Nazarbayev, Shalkat, of course, and against the family and the elites, they were not for Tokayev. I mean, he didn't gain any points, in the people's eyes, he's still part of that same administration. So he's got to be real careful and wondering a lot about how much political reform he can actually introduce, because it might end up toppling him in the end.
You raise a very interesting point, Bruce. We focus so much on who might have been against Tokayev, who the plotters were, but who has actually been for Tokayev? This is a very interesting question, and one that we have to look at going forward. Well, we've come to the end of our session, and I think it's been extremely informative discussion. Great to hear the different perspectives. And my sincere thanks goes to Bruce, Dasim, and Kate for your time and contributions. And I thank you to the audience as well for your questions. And we certainly look forward to keeping in touch and continuing the dialogue. A final reminder is that this session has been recorded, so you can catch up on Chatham House's YouTube channel if you've missed anything. Thanks again, and until we meet again.